Welcome to Engaging ESG, the podcast that considers what it takes to get ESG communications right and how it can go oh so wrong. It's season 2 and we're back for more. Once again, we're looking at real-life examples of ESG messaging, some that will inspire and some that may make you cringe. I'm Jennifer Owens, Director of Marketing at Flowcarbon.
And I'm Kati Callens, Lead for Sustainability at Adobe. In this 11-part series, we're delving into the complexity of ESG comms, industry by industry. We'll highlight lessons learned and share practical tips you and your team can use today as you navigate the evolving landscape of environmental, social, and governance topics. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to Engaging ESG, the podcast that offers the full scope of ESG comms. How are you feeling, Kati?
I'm feeling expansive, as in all the feels. And for today, all the categories of greenhouse gas emissions.
Very nice. I think you and I are going to go on stage as like the new Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis or something with us.
I love that.
That's our next career. So, because today we are talking about scopes 1, 2, and of course 3. I feel like my entire life is spent talking about scope 3 these days. And we're going to talk about not only why these are important, but how leading companies are considering and communicating their approach, especially to scope 3. So as the resident smarty pants, may I ask you to offer to frame the conversation for us as to exactly what do we mean by scopes 1, 2, and 3, and why do I have to talk about it all the time?
Yes, for sure. Happy to talk about the definitions of scope 1, 2, and 3. And you won't be surprised to learn that my favorite way to think about the scopes involves food, specifically pizza.
Awesome. Bring it on. Okay. You have my attention.
Yes. I think I mentioned pizza in the last episode. So everyone must be on to the fact that we're recording this near lunch.
Yeah.
Cool. But so let's start with scope 1. Another term for scope 1 is direct emissions. So these are the direct emissions that come from sources owned or controlled by a company. So think about the exhaust from a company car or the emissions from a factory's smokestack. These emissions are the ones that the company has the most control over as they're directly tied to its operations. So let's say we are at a pizzeria. We could call it Jen's Pizza House.
Nice. So Jen's That's very creative. Yes.
Very creative. They definitely won't know what we do there. Jen's Pizza House owns a wood fire oven, and the smoke that billows out while baking those delicious pies would be considered a scope 1. Okay. It's direct. It's within the control of the business to manage and reduce, possibly by installing more efficient ovens or using cleaner burning wood, or, as we discussed last week, switching to a totally electric pizza oven.
That's right. I'm already on it for that. So good. Okay. Yeah, I'm on.
Great. Thank you, Jen. We've already changed your name. The branding
already
clearly
changed your name. Well, we did some A/B testing and Jane worked better. So there you go.
So now Jane's Pizza House. So we're going to tell you about scope 2, Jane. Indirect emissions from purchased electricity. So these are the emissions that are created by the production of electricity, heat, or steam that a company purchases and uses. So if we're talking about Jane or Jen's Pizzeria, the electricity used to light up the restaurant and run the refrigerator is considered a scope 2 emissions. So although the pizzeria doesn't produce the emissions directly, they are a consequence of the company's energy consumption. So a way to reduce scope 2 emissions for the pizzeria might be opting to source its energy from renewable sources or implementing energy efficient technology.
And as this is all of this podcast is really just an excuse for me to learn more, but that is and why my life is spent talking about scope 3 is because I'm not in renewables. I'm not working in solar. We're dealing with the emissions, which is what takes us to scope 3.
Scope 3, other indirect emissions, also known as the hot topic at all sustainability and climate conversations. You could probably walk into any event and just say, scope 3, don't you know it? And shake your head and everyone would be like, wow, yes.
Yeah,
that person knows what they're talking about. One of my favorite things to say at like a networking event when I don't know people or really like exactly what we're talking about is just to respond, in this economy, it works in all situations. And so we're now giving you the other thing you can mention in any climate circle. Scope 3 emissions. Can't handle them.
Yeah, really. It's just, that's scope 3.
Okay, but what do we mean by scope 3? So when you say this on maybe you're on your climate pizza networking tour, we want people to know what the scope 3 emissions are. So those stand for other indirect emissions. And they are known as the trickiest because these are all the other indirect emissions that occur in a company's value chain. This means they can come from sources not owned or directly controlled by the company, but are associated with activities. So back to the pizzeria. The emissions from the cheese supplier's factory or the fuel used by a delivery service to bring ingredients to the pizzeria, or even the greenhouse gas emissions emitted when the flour for the dough was grown and harvested. These are all scope 3 emissions. One of the reasons that they're the trickiest is because they're hard to calculate and reduce, as they involve kind of complex supply chains and processes outside of the company's direct control. But as companies are getting more handle on their direct emissions, and also as we are slowly decarbonizing the grid, they represent often the largest share of a company's carbon footprint and thus present really significant opportunities for emission reduction. So hard to calculate, hard to get information about, but once you can, there's really just so much potential impact.
The scope 3 is huge. And would it be safe to say for all companies nearly that scope 3 is bigger than scopes 1 and 2? Like back when doing all the content for Meta Sustainability, one of our big shout outs is that we achieved net zero greenhouse gas emissions in direct operations, scopes 1 and 2, in 2020. But we were still there working.
Totally. And that was a great accomplishment. I think it depends on the company and where they are in their decarbonization journey.
Okay.
So in season 2 of the podcast, we've been talking about a lot of industries that we have difficult to abate, hard to decarbonize. And in certain industries, they're still trying to figure out scope 1 and scope 2. Airlines are a perfect example, right? Like they have direct control over the emissions of their product, of their service offering. So I would say scope 3 can be big for companies, and that's definitely where a lot of companies are turning to, but there are also companies that are still trying to navigate scope 1 and scope 2. So it kind of depends on where they are in their decarbonization journey. I also think it really depends on kind of what products you create and how far down the supply chain that work happens. So I think in tech, we are very familiar with scope 3 because that's where a lot of companies, our biggest kind of emissions that we haven't been able to touch or whittle down yet because we're deep in the supply chain. But I wouldn't say scope 3 is everyone's biggest emissions factor, but it's becoming that way for sure.
And it's constantly evolving. And I think one of the interesting things that for me learning was that you never fully achieve it. Okay, so they achieved scopes 1 and 2 in 2020 at Meta, but that number continues to grow as the company grows. So it's a constant effort to maintain that in addition to looking at scope 3.
Yes, exactly. And so when we think about scope 3 for a tech company like Meta, it is the factories that produce their VR headsets or the zillions of hard drives that fill their data centers. And that would be variable depending on, do they own the data centers or do they lease the data centers? We won't go into that, but that's also once again, like how direct versus indirect. And I think it's also important to note that in the case of Meta, as with most companies, these emissions are constantly evolving. In many cases, as a company grows, is successful in the marketplace, that also influences their emissions profile. So in some ways, this is where I think you can get into some of the challenges around, if we're talking about communications and getting different business units involved, is we don't want to go to them and say, hey, can you guys just sell a little less of your products and be a little less successful? Of course not, right? That's not the point of the company. But if you set these targets for reduction in emissions and then your company continues to grow, that's going to be something that you're going to have to navigate around efficiencies and how you're going to kind of continue to bring down the overall emissions.
Yeah. Well, so leaving tech, I thought a good company to focus on in this conversation is another huge multinational company. In fact, it's the world's largest retailer, Walmart. So I covered Walmart a lot when I was at Women's Wear Daily. I mean, you can't not, in the world of retail and manufacturing, cover Walmart. So
right.
They had set an operational goal of net zero for scopes 1 and 2 by 2040, which is huge. They have 1 million employees. I'm sure it's over that now. It's huge. Direct is huge for them, to your point. But in talking about scope 3, the story that I thought we could look at is their Project Gigaton, which I love. It sounds like Mothra and Godzilla and Gigaton. So,
yes.
And I love it. They launched it in 2017 as a way to work with their suppliers to reduce, avoid, or sequester 1 gigaton or 1 billion metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions. And they were aiming to do 1 gigaton in its product value chain by 2030. And for a point of context, fun fact, 1 gigaton is more than the annual emissions of all of Germany.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. I'll meet that fun fact with another fun fact, which is Germany is only one of a handful of countries that has incorporated a goal of net zero by or before 2050 into its national law.
Nice.
Second, likely true fun fact, Germans like pretzels more than pizza. We'll forgive them. Yeah. The people have, their own country carbs that they like best. So
that's very true. We should do a whole series on carbs and GHG
putting
emissions.
The carbs in carbon.
Oh my God. I'm seriously putting a pin in that for later. So, so we have, a fact. Thank you for building on our facts here. Now, I love the name Project Gigaton because it's playing off of what we know about Walmart, which is that it's huge. And Project Gigaton was one of the first corporate initiatives centered solely on addressing scope 3 emissions. And they crossed the halfway point in 2022 when they made it to 574 million metric tons of reduction of carbon across 4,500 suppliers.
Woohoo!
Which is pretty impressive. And now they say that Project Gigaton is one of the largest private sector consortium of its kind, with more than 5,900 suppliers have signed up. And its reporting suppliers represent approximately 75% of U.S. product net sales dollars, which is huge by share, but also the sheer volume of Walmart sales. And here's how big Walmart is in terms of retail and buying and exporting and all that sort of or importing, is that when I was at Footwear News, they said that the Walmart footwear department, if you've ever been to a Walmart, there is a very sad footwear department. You don't want any of those shoes. I mean, I don't know. Not to diss anyone who buys Walmart shoes, but they didn't care about that department. They didn't put their energy into that department. It just existed.
They weren't putting that foot forward.
It represented 20% of footwear sales in the U.S.
Wow.
Just by existing at the time. And so
that reminds
Walmart.
Me. Yeah. Sorry, just to interject. That reminds me of a stat that I remember I heard about organic milk products, that once they started being carried by a Walmart, it boosted the industry by some crazy percentage. We can look it up.
Because it's there.
Yeah.
And there's good and bad that comes with it. They can push prices down for manufacturing. There's all of that. But just to say, they have sheer size. And so when they commit to something like this, it has real impact. And they achieved their 2030 goal more than 6 years early. They've already hit 1 gigaton of reduced carbon.
That's awesome. How did they do it?
Well, so they went with, the scientists and the experts, and they worked with the World Wildlife Fund, the Environmental Defense Fund, World Resources Institute, and they created science-based goals. Always a help. Let's start with the science. Then they worked with their suppliers to create concrete emissions targets. And they were looking at energy efficiency, packaging redesign, food waste reduction, and trucking load optimization. And here's the thing, because they're so huge, this was a thing that smaller companies by size, every company is smaller. Walmart can kind of go in and kind of gently, not so gently, say to their suppliers, hey, we want you to consider this. We want you to do this. They have a lot more sway and leverage when that happens. So they were able to use their sheer size to impact change. And then it found, you will not be surprised, that these projects that reduced emissions often had other positive impacts. They felt they had enhanced resilience, they reduced costs, they improved quality, and then that resulted in new products for customers. That it's the flywheel. The flywheel started to spin.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I do know, though, with Walmart's scale and size of all the products that they do carry, sad footwear section included.
Yes.
I have to imagine. Now I really want to see what those sections are like. I have to imagine that not every supplier was jumping for joy.
Right.
When they heard about
Walmart's
this.
forcing us into the future. Yay.
Yeah. People love to be forced. Classic human nature.
And told that they're wrong. Like you're doing it wrong. Like, okay, thank you. Well, so they knew they were dealing with suppliers at all different levels of readiness and capability. So they provided support and resources to help them set goals, how to take action, how to report back on the process. And then they organized best practice sharing summits, and they made tools like the circular connector and the factory energy efficiency. And Kathleen McLaughlin, who is their chief sustainability officer and also runs the Walmart Foundation, she said that what worked was a willingness to be flexible about requirements, depending on the size of the supplier, like meeting them where they are and then moving forward, setting clear expectations about what it would take to be considered a leader within the program. There was a recent change that required suppliers to share their entire operational emissions footprint and not of their reduction project. So, you can't just talk about your pilot. You have to talk about the whole company, which I love. You just keep evolving and getting better. And then they work on tools. They have a team that's helping with like the Gigaton PPA program, which how do you procure renewables for your scope 1 and 2? And now they're working to enhance the estimates of the scope 3 emissions to assess which elements are addressable and which ones are out of their control. Because as we've talked a lot about this season, the accounting is so hard. That's everybody's trying to get better at tracking everything.
Definitely. Yeah, that's great to hear more about their program. I remember hearing about it when it launched, and I haven't heard an update. So grateful for this download today. And just building on some of what you were mentioning around carbon accounting, I think one of the reasons it's such a huge issue for sustainability reporting and many experts is that there's not a lot of standards around how companies calculate the greenhouse gases they emit. And this lack of standardization across the industries can make it really difficult to compare and benchmark emissions data, which can then hinder efforts to set meaningful targets and track progress. And so, in some ways, there's like that kind of counter flywheel where people want to look at their broader supply chain, want to understand like from scope 3 perspective, how they can have reductions, but then they hit all these like brick walls around lack of data, lack of information, and it can take a while to get that. And then the other piece too is like, when are people reporting on that data? How do you keep things up to date for like, is it annual reporting, quarterly reporting? I think that's also, those time horizons can vary a lot.
Oh, completely. I mean, that kind of transparency is what is going to drive reliability and then build even better transparency. And so that then filters through to the customer to better understand what their choices are resulting in. So because, we hear a lot of, and we feel it, a lot of the consumer saying, hey, we care. We're interested in this. We want to know how to make the right choice. And so all this transparency, it's what's needed to actually make people feel secure in the choices and the information that they're offered, as opposed to just saying the snack wells are fat free. And then you're like, oh, but what about the sugar? Everything comes down to food. So
Definitely.
they are exploring, Walmart says it's working on new ways to mitigate emissions, engage customers in lowering emissions. It's raising the bar on what it has, what it's calling Giga Guru. Because what I love is the whole marketing side of this, because it's their B2B marketing is dealing with all their suppliers, and you're in the club and you can gamify it a little bit, become a guru. And, it's excellence in target setting, taking action, getting results. And it recently asked suppliers to expand on their emissions footprint reporting and set higher and higher targets.
Yeah. No, I agree. I like seeing that. It's important for companies who have these huge supplier footprints to really take the lead around transparency, corporate climate action. And that goes from in setting their own emissions to supporting more standardized calculations to offsetting hard to abate emissions. And a more sustainable supply chain benefits not really just the business, but also, of course, the people, the communities, and the broader society that are impacted by those supply chains. I also think that there's an interesting kind of downstream impact of all the suppliers Walmart gets into Project Gigaton, because, they're going to have the transparency for other corporate clients and reporting.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's an interesting piece around kind of the potential of long tail benefits and where they can be for other corporate clients. I think one of the interesting critiques about Scope 3 is it is so much data, it is so much work, and like, who is it really benefiting long term to have all these companies doing like another detailed accounting exercise? And I think that is a good point, right? Like, we want to make sure we're moving things forward and not just creating more paperwork and data. But there is this interesting kind of flywheel knock-on effect that can happen when there is kind of enough suppliers in a particular organization or field that are all starting to report and be more transparent, that it just kind of improves the progression and kind of overall impact of a broader field.
Well, because I don't think there is any person who's come up through content or marketing that doesn't know the feeling of someone saying, well, we could track that. Why aren't you tracking X? And, it's like, and then like 2 months later, no one ever asks you about whatever it is that you had to go jump through every hoop to track. So, yeah. Yes, it can be tracked. Does it have my running joke is A/B testing. Like, every place I ever work, it's like, we ought to do A/B testing. What are we testing for? What's the objective? And then, and then it disappears. It always becomes the fad of the moment. So all this stuff too, is that it's the objective that we're going for, and that these suppliers who have other things to do too, that this stuff is it all has impact, and that they're rewarded for it. And we're all rewarded for it because they're reducing emissions.
For sure.
So yes, I think, and you're so right about Walmart, because their impact on these suppliers is large. And so that impacts the way the suppliers work with others.
For sure. I think one of the other reasons this is really important is that there's interesting data coming out around kind of supply chain emissions and transparency. It's estimated that a company's supply chain produces 11 times more emissions than its direct operations. So any sort of corporate ESG or sustainability goals should lean heavily on supply chain operations.
Yeah.
And if you want to make substantial improvements against your ESG or sustainability goals, there's kind of no way to do it without including the supply chain procurement teams in both your strategy and your communications. And this is not just an anecdote from my experience inside the company.
You're just making this up? Yeah. Okay.
Thankfully, I am not. But in particular, it was interesting. We saw a PwC survey, a 2023 digital trends survey for supply chain, that found that 41% of the respondents believed that supply chain strategy and operations are important to executing an ESG strategy, but only 32% of the respondents said their company accurately measures digital investments and ESG impact on the supply chain.
That tracks.
Yeah. And they also found that several interrelated issues are impacting progress towards more sustainable supply chains, including market shifts, lack of immediacy due to focus on the now. And it argued that decarbonization needs to be reframed more as a business imperative with a defined return on investment. And I have to agree with this. I think that there's so much work to be done. And of course, people are going to be focused on quarterly earnings. They're going to be focused on, what can we achieve in the short term? But we also need to build in these longer term kind of cultural, systematic changes to companies if we're going to have an overhaul of our supply chains. CDP, also known as the Carbon Disclosure Project, and is one of the kind of major players evaluating companies' work. A lot of organizations, including Adobe, reports to them. They noted that of the organizations that report to CDP, Scope 3 targets only make up 15% of all new or in progress carbon targets.
Which leaves us as comms folks, and the companies, of course, too, but exposed if you are focused solely on touting, yay, Scope 1 and 2, and then your customer comes and says, hey, what about all of this? Or your B2B customers come and ask you that. Like I think we need to get that 15% up. I think that's, I've gone way out on a limb to say that. So.
No, definitely. And I think there is just so much learning that's being done in real time by companies. And I think it's also interesting to consider this in light of some of the greenwashing and green hushing legislation that's coming out, Jen, where people are having to really account for the claims that they're making. And organizations, rather talking about climate targets and not including Scope 3, they're just not going to be taken seriously, quite frankly, because that's kind of the easier part of the footprint, right? And if you don't have targets for Scope 3, then that's going to be table stakes pretty soon.
You're not really doing the full homework. It's not extra credit. It's actually part of the test. So we need to.
Speaking of extra credit, actually, that's a great interlude into one more thing I wanted us to touch on before we closed, which is
Don't get us lost. Don't get us lost.
Yes, not too lost, hopefully. But yeah, there's a relevant concept that's been popping up a bit more, and it is a term that is BYCM, or known as Beyond Value Chain Mitigation. And the concept is that you have traditional corporate sustainability that we've talked about today, focusing on direct and indirect emissions, scopes 1, 2, and 3. And organizations are actively reducing and influencing these emission reductions. But beyond value chain mitigation, that's a mouthful.
Yeah.
BVCM really thinks kind of beyond the boundaries of companies, including...
This is where I get lost. Okay, yeah.
So it's influencing emissions reduction on a societal scale. And SBTI, Net Zero Standard, Science-Based Targets, they have recently been pushing for BVCM, urging businesses to influence broader societal emission reductions, arguing for its ability to broadly scale impact and improve society at large. And I found a quote that said, "It's more than a concept, it's a call to action."
Yeah.
And I love that. I love the idea of thinking about, what's possible and how do we push beyond that. Thankfully, this piece I was reading kind of grounded us in a specific example, which was Unilever's Climate and Nature Fund that's driving greenhouse gas emission reductions on a wider scale than their immediate business boundaries. And I get where they're coming from. I understand that we have to standardize and also think about a company's kind of beyond their four walls around influence. We think about this with policy advocacy and thought leadership. But my question to you, Jen, is if Scope 3 is as audacious as everyone says it is, can we really be expecting companies to move beyond Scope 3 into BVCM? Does that seem important, realistic, inspirational? It seems like we still have a lot to figure out with Scope 3, and I'm not exactly sure what we're getting out of kind of asking people to do that as a baseline, and most people aren't. And on top of it, add this extra credit.
Right. I think there's real value in saying, oh, wait, there's more. Just to say that there is no end. Excuse me. And we should be getting used to that.
Mm-hmm.
That even those who achieve their net zero goals, it doesn't end. You got to keep at it. And then if you get through to scope 1 and 2, it doesn't end. You go to scope 3. And I hate to tell you, people, it doesn't end. And I'm someone who loves
It's like
to write
the song
things
that
down.
never ends.
Yeah,
It
I
goes
want
on
to
and on,
cross
my
things off
friend.
my to-do list too, but it's never going to happen. So we just got to keep working on it every ding dang day. But yeah, so I've been working on my class at the wonderful University of Cambridge on sustainability, marketing, media, and creative. And they would say, of course we do this. Every company needs to become a purpose-driven organization. You put the purpose in the middle, and this is part of our life as responsible citizens. It's just, what's the Supreme Court case, Citizens United, that said companies are people, and that they can give as much money as they want to political candidates. All right, well, then we'll treat them as people, and they need to be working like we all do and reducing our footprint everywhere we go. That's my radical statement.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I do think it is valuable to have kind of an extreme end of what's possible so that organizations keep striving for that, and it kind of slowly raises the baseline and the benchmarking of what's expected. So for that work, sure. Let's accept it. And I look forward to kind of seeing where beyond value chain mitigation goes moving forward.
And to that end, our journey into the scopes and beyond has come to an end. Spoiler alert, next episode is closing out our second season.
Oh, yes. I can't believe it's already almost ending. We will be rounding out season 2 with a conversation about the past, present, and future of ESG comms. But before we do, we'd love to hear what our listeners are thinking about, especially in terms of where ESG comms is going. So please do share with us your own arc at engagingesg@gmail.com, and we'll share your insights with a bit of an AMA session.
Yes, it's become our new season finale tradition, which I am looking forward to that. And I'm looking forward to thanking all of you for joining us. And as always, keep engaging. Thank you for joining us on Engaging ESG. Have a question for us to consider or a strategy you'd like us to cover? Email us today at engagingesg@gmail.com.
Please remember to rate, review, and subscribe to Engaging ESG today. It helps us grow, and even better, be sure to share the podcast with your favorite sustainability, diversity, or social impact colleague. And until next time, keep engaging.
This podcast is part of the Sound Advice FM network. Sound Advice FM, women's voices amplified.